a little drama from something, a little Nick history, Nick lore, not recent. It was recent history because Phil Jackson has written a book with longtime NBA scribe Sam Smith, talking about some of the greatest players in the league. He writes about Carmelo, and he basically said two things. At the end, he said if Carmelo was going to stay, at the time Phil Jackson and the Knicks agreed to part ways, Carmelo was going to stay. Phil Jackson said, I should probably go. Because the relationship at that point, he said, was so busted, is the word he used. And I think he was right. I think that when you look back on that thing, I think both parties are at fault with Carmelo and Phil. But to me, Phil, as the team president, the Zen master, I thought that he should have done more to get Carmelo Anthony to buy in. Maybe he did, and maybe Carmelo just didn't want to buy into the triangle, and that's where it ended. But I just thought, just being around there, Phil could have, maybe should have done more one-on-one with Carmelo Anthony to appeal to him and to get him to buy in to that style. But Phil Jackson getting into some of that stuff in a new book, and he also talked about wanting to trade Carmelo and telling Jim Dolan once, we have to trade this guy. Well, Phil Jackson's the one who gave him that no trade clause in that negotiation, so he hamstrung himself there. But I just remember that era, man, for a lot of off the court stuff, a lot of crazy stuff coming out, a lot of resistance to the triangle, a lot of from the front office push towards running the triangle. Joakim Noah, bad signing. The report about Phil Jackson. Actually, I don't know, if he was having health issues, but at practice there was, I think it was Jay Williams that said he fell asleep in one of the workouts, and you're around there, you hear similar things. And so Phil Jackson just could not replicate his success as a coach in that Knicks presidency. Really, there's not much to talk about from that era. But I thought the book was interesting. Shaun, who do you pinpoint at fault there? And if you're picking Carmelo or you're picking Phil?
There's a Drake line on the song Pipe Down where he says, if you were to write a book, it would be a tell some, not a tell all. And Phil is writing a tell some book, and he's telling Phil was terrible. And Phil, honestly, I feel like wasted Carmelo Anthony's prime and blames Carmelo Anthony for it. I mean, we were all here. So when I see some of those lineups with Langston Galloway and Lou Amundsen and Jason Smith and Samuel Dallenberg and Quincy Acey, stop me when I name somebody who's a relevant second option to a player that you're trying to build a contender with. I think that Phil just completely dismantled, what was possible for Melo's prime, forcing the triangle, saying he's not buying into running a triangle with Sasha Vujacic and Lou Amundsen. Maybe not, I don't know. I think that Phil made everything about Phil while he was here. And, everything had to be Phil's way, but Phil didn't have an established way. Phil had an established way as a head coach. Phil didn't have an established way as a GM, as a president of basketball operations. He was in over his head, and he acted like everyone else was drowning. And it was just very upsetting. And so some people should just go sit down somewhere and eat their food. And Phil Jackson is one of those people. We don't need this book. We don't need Carmelo being blamed. Carmelo is the easy scapegoat. I feel like at some point, I'm 31 years old. I feel like Phil's a lot older than me. And I feel like in most situations, I learned to be accountable and self-aware. And Phil instead, handles it how he does. So that's where I'm at. I try to say it as nicely as possible on the air.
No, it is. It's not surprising, but if he's going to really rehash it, you got to point the finger at yourself somewhat, Coach. For you, that era, Phil Jackson, Carmelo, who are you pointing the finger at? Because there are a lot of people who would point it at Carmelo. I wouldn't, but a lot of people would. He was such a lightning rod as a player.
Yeah, listen, and I should say I am a longtime Knicks fan. So I'm almost 50 years old. I've gone through the grind, the ups and downs, and there were a lot of downs. Listen, I'm gonna say it like this: the blame initially goes to James Dolan. Because we could have sat and we could have waited and got Carmelo as a free agent and not gutted the roster, trading Mozgov, trading Wilson Chandler, right? In regards to that trade that got us Carmelo. So James Dolan panicked and went over Donnie Walsh's head. When you get to the situation of Phil versus Carmelo, listen, Carmelo's a scorer. Like, you know what you're going to get at Carmelo. Could he have done more to buy in? Maybe. But at the end of the day, you had a GM that was literally trying to recreate a 90s style offense that didn't have Jordan and Pippen or Shaq and Kobe. So instead of him kind of looking at a roster of what he had and trying to manipulate the roster in regards to a way that would work for him, he brought in guys like Jeff Hornacek. He brought in guys who weren't even guys that ran the triangle offense. So to me, there's a lot of blame in regard to how Phil ran it. James Dolan just kind of giving him the keys and letting him do what he had to do. It was just a lot of mistakes that were making. I mean, don't even bring up the Frank Ntilikina draft, who we could have ended up, who wanted to be here as a Knick when that went down. So to me, Phil Jackson, I think, is a way just trying to come back and have some kind of relevancy. I think he knows that if he tries to pick a fight with Carmelo, with the Knicks fans, he's going to get the smoke. And I don't think he minds it. I think he wants it. He wants the attention. He wants people to talk about him and his book. But at the end of the day, any right-mind Knicks fan will look at that era as such a dark era that I wish he would be history, and we don't have to hear about Phil Jackson talking about the Knicks again, to be quite honest with you.
The place I go just quickly is, Steve Kerr, so close to landing him. And I think Marv Albert told him, hey, just don't go there. You won't have success there. Kerr decided to go to Golden State, and the rest is history. But imagine if Steve Kerr decided to come to New York, and how that would have impacted Golden State and the Knicks in NBA history. So always an interesting what if for me.